is an indication of the widespread scramble to access sources of economic power, education, and jobs. In some states, such as Tamil Nadu, 69% of the seats in institutions of higher learning are reserved. It is increasingly clear that merely increasing the reservation quotas will not deliver the required results. While reservation may be a necessity to correct the legacy of social injustices, the current trajectory suggests that the polity in India can get further fragmented. As elections and policies further reinforce this fragmentation, secularism is likely to suffer. There is one good news which very few people reflect on. There is a structural shift in India that may slow down this process. It is expected that over the next 20 years, as much as 300 to 350 million people will migrate from villages to the cities. Cities connect the poor to the benefits of commerce, better access to services compared to the village, and more weight on skills than on caste backgrounds. So that may reverse. Federalism is another interesting example. The state and the central government relationships are evolving. The tense relationship between the states and the center in defining the respective orbits of influence, especially when the parties and coalitions in power do not agree, can lead to interesting dynamics. For example, during the decade of 1950 to 59, state governments were dismissed using Article 356 only 6 times. During the following decades, the number escalated rapidly. For example, during the decade of the 60s, state governments were dismissed 11 times, 7 of which happened during 67-69. In the 1970s, it was done 40 times, 9 of which happened in 1977. It came down in 1980s to 22 and to 15 in 1990s. 5 out of the 15 incidents of president's rule during 1990s was in the Northeast for security reasons. As the center weakened with coalition governments, and as the regional parties became dominant, many states, the ability to override the power of the state diminished as well. If the first phase of relationship between the center and the states was defined by a strong national party at the center, and also in many states, the second phase of coalition politics represents an implicit dialogue between various parties that do not share the necessary power to cancel each other out. Coalition politics may have rendered the excesses of the 1970s a thing of the past. The new debate in the federal structure is exemplified by the demand for Telangana. There was almost 30 years of stability with the formation of new states, very few new states like Goa, Puducherry, Delhi, Sikkim, and adding them to the Union. However, during 2000, 3 new states were carved out of Bihar and Orissa and Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, Uttarakhand, and Chhattisgarh. The Telangana issue is likely to trigger another difficult debate in the federal-state relationships. What criteria should we use? Governability and responsiveness of the government based on size of the population, or deepening identity politics? Andhra Pradesh was slipped from Madras presidency and Gujarat from Maharashtra based on language. What should the new criteria be? Telangana and Andhra will still have the same language. This debate is likely to consume significant national attention and may herald the next phase of the evolving state-federal relationships. Judicial review is also sacrosanct as a building block of the Constitution. Mr. Sarabji argued in his Palkhivla lecture here in 2008 that judicial activism is well and alive in India. He said, quest for justice, especially social justice and relief of human suffering, is the paramount motivation for judicial activism. And remember that the fundamental rights of our people will remain ornamental showpieces and become teasing illusions unless they are translated by activist judges into living realities and become meaningful at least to some downtrodden and exploited segments of Indian humanity. And he concluded his remarks that day by saying, judicial activism will certainly be a boon if there are sensible, sensitive, and courageous judges who do not flinch from deciding against the government of the day, judges who are not swayed by popular praise or clamor, judges who do not make judicial restraint a pretext for self-abnegation, judges who exercise judicial power actively and vigorously and without straying into forbidden fields. And I venture to say that, occasional judicial aberrations apart, India is one such country, and I thank the Almighty for that and pray that their tribe may increase and judicial activism proves beneficial to we the people of India and enables them to live a life of dignity and fully realize that human potential. I wholeheartedly agree with his extremely well-argued position. So what is our overall scorecard before we go to think about how to change it? India has fared well overall. India during the last 15 years has come out of hibernation. Even poorly governed states are making progress. Consider the growth rates during 2007 and 8. Bihar grew at 13%, Jharkhand at 11%, and Orissa at 13%. There is a lot to celebrate. While there is noteworthy progress, India is also regressing in many aspects of governance. The seeds of greatness and the seeds of failure seem to coexist. And that, I think, is an important lesson for us. While I have always been an optimist about India, highlighting our opportunities and successes, today I plan to focus on the incipient dangers to India's continuing success. There are obvious blemishes in the record, in the practice and principles enshrined in the Constitution. The reasons for this are many, but the most important are the following. Converting a shortage economy into an opportunity for personal gain. A significant rent-seeking behavior has developed at all levels of government, be it the legislative, executive, or the judiciary. Corruption is pervasive and it gnaws at the very vitals of the rule of law. Most people take corruption as a way of life and do not believe that it can be solved in our lifetime. There is a sense of resignation and acceptance of the status quo. This corrosive influence, if not corrected in time, can make a mockery of the Indian Constitution and its basic architecture, which Palkhivla so valiantly defended. Political fragmentation and the focus on caste-based group rights and coalition politics may become a divisive force, challenging the ability of the governments to do what is right. What is expedient and urgent will dominate what is right and important. We see it already. Judicial activism may now be the basic protection against violations on the rights of we the people in practice, protecting them from both the transgressions of the legislative and the executive branches. The basic question that all of us face is, what are the responsibilities of power? Given this mixed scorecard, how do we move forward? What should citizens be concerned about? How can they help to change the trajectory? We have to recognize we are at crossroads. Already 170 districts in India out of 560 are ungovernable. The Naxalite problem may be an indication of the corrosive influence of apathy, carelessness, the denial of basic requirements of social justice, the rule of law, and the acceptance and denial of opportunities such as education, healthcare, and jobs. The spread of Naxalite insurgency must be a cause of concern for all of us. The Prime Minister called this the single biggest internal security challenge faced by our country. The problem did not happen overnight. Actually, if you go back and look at the last 30 years and the spread of the insurgency, it is very illustrative. It goes at the very spine of India. The problem is essentially a result of over 50 years of carelessness corruption, and exploitation. The ingredients that spread insurgency are clear. They are low or non-existent commitment to human development, education, health, and jobs, and high levels of corruption, largely in the form of exploitation of land and a marginalization of the native people's rights. It is no surprise that Naxalite movement is the strongest in areas where human development index is very low and corruption index is very high. We have within us the ability to change this process of deterioration by making the administrative and governance of India more transparent, less exploitative, and more equitable. The problem of governance in India are not a case of lack of resources. They are due to a lack of accountability and apathy on the part of leaders. For a radical change of the status quo, we have to start by understanding the origins of rent-seeking behavior. Why is there so much corruption? Is this an indication of national character, in which case we can't do much, or a result of the structure of governance that we have created? I believe it is a structural problem. Therefore, we can change the structure. The first problem that I see is supply-demand imbalance. Let me explain what it is. In every country, supply-demand imbalances create opportunities for rent-seeking. Consider India under the license Raj. Many of us will remember the long lines for buying a telephone, a car, or even a two-wheeler. Why? The demand far exceeded supply, and there were artificial restrictions imposed on growth, supply, through licensing. The distortions of market mechanisms caused by the license Raj forced an alternative market to evolve. Corruption became a substitute for the market. People in power, both politicians and bureaucrats, recognized that they could arbitrage the supply-demand imbalance by charging a premium for privileged access. Today, with plentiful supply, there is no need to seek special favors to get a telephone, or a car, or a motorbike. So the first reality of corruption in India is that we must change the supply-demand imbalance by creating domestic supply to exceed domestic demand. And we can get rid of some forms of corruption, not all of it, some forms of corruption. A similar shortage exists in higher education. When the capacity for higher education and engineering, for example, was very restricted, every applicant had to either pay a capitation fee or know someone of importance to get admission. Engineering schools are overbuilt in Andhra Pradesh. Andhra Pradesh has between 300 to 450 engineering schools, depending on whom you believe in. And that is true. There is no reliable data. And I can tell you, I searched and searched for reliable data. The numbers are between 350 and 450. And more than 130,000 to 140,000 seat capacity. That is 20% of the national capacity. Now that there is excess capacity in Andhra Pradesh, the engineering schools are scrambling to get students. Students and parents can now focus on quality and pick and choose in a fashion no different from scooters and telephones. The engineering schools are also diversifying their offerings, offering more models to protect their investment by changing their product mix. Many are considering a shift to vocational training as well. Same thing will happen to management schools. But there is a problem in India. While Andhra Pradesh is awash with engineering education capacity, it is also useful to remember that this is a very asymmetric development. 4 states, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Maharashtra, account for 57.6% of all the engineering seats. UP, Bihar, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, and Jharkhand, taken together, only account for 19% of seats, less than one state called Andhra Pradesh. There is a tremendous asymmetry and therefore opportunity still for corruption. Of course, in a system used to complex and opaque rules and politicians and bureaucrats' ability to interpret it, there exists a new opportunity to arbitrage. This is evident in the acquisition of land, getting environmental permits, mining concessions, or auctioning the mobile spectrum. There is time value to money. Therefore, delays are worth money. Similarly, access to scarce resources is monetizable. So creating a complex system that makes access difficult and not transparent is of value. This process permeates from the low-level corruption such as accessing land records, getting caste certificates, to ration cards, to large-scale corruption such as approvals for special economic zones or accessing the 3G spectrum. Inequality or opportunities is also a major contributor to corruption. For example, in the absence of equality of access to educational opportunities, especially K-12, it is not difficult to come to the conclusion that access to jobs must be based on criteria other than merit. Let me repeat. In the absence of equality of access to educational opportunities, it is not difficult to come to the conclusion that access to job must be based on criteria other than merit. More importantly, only the well-to-do and those in urban areas get access to learn English, a prerequisite for admission to elite colleges and well-paying jobs. It is no surprise that parents, both rich and poor, are clamoring for an English education for their children. English has overtaken Hindi as their desired medium of instruction in India. Politicians who supported local language as the basis for instruction, and some still do, have to recognize that the bottom-up revolution in India is about getting access to good quality education that will provide access to good job opportunities. People want universal access for good quality education, and at the political level, the fight is for privileged access with little or no focus on quality. Caste-based reservations have become the norm. Every group and politician want to fight for minority rights. This is the direct and logical consequence of failure to come to terms with inequality of opportunities in this country. Too much of the national focus is on inequality of incomes, but not the root cause, which is the inequality of opportunity. It is not surprising that politicians focus on group rights as a way of mediating the problems through caste-based reservations. And finally, a favorite subject for all of you, campaign financing. The 2009 Lok Sabha elections is reported to have cost the country approximately 10,000 crores. Of this, 1,300 crores was spent by the Election Commission and 700 crores by central and state governments for photo identity cards, electronic polling machines, etc. Political parties and individual candidates spent 8,000 crores. This is about 15 crores per constituency. Just the Lok Sabha election cost the country 8,000 crores in private spending. If you include the cost of elections in the states and in major metros, the overall private spending in India in elections could easily exceed 25,000 crores. People tell me that's a very modest estimate, but I'll start with an estimate. There is an important reason why I think we should come to terms with it. I cannot but assume that private funding of elections of this magnitude is not predicated on making an appropriate return. Given the risky nature of investment in elections, and if you think of politicians as venture capitalists, we can assume they will not settle for less than a tenfold return. The cost to the country in corruption far exceeds 250,000 crores. That, I think, is the key. If 25,000 crores is what it costs to compete for elections, 250,000 crores will be taken out as corruption. The economic and developmental impact of this level of corruption is in order to estimate. This drain on the country due to corruption gets worse with time. Corruption increases the private spending capacity. The cost of elections in Lok Sabha has systematically gone up. It was estimated at 2,200 crores in 1996, 3,200 crores in 1998, 4,500 crores in 2004, and 10,000 crores in 2009. There has been threefold increase in 10 years. The vicious cycle of corruption leading to more corruption is a reality. No one is exempt from this process. Every party and all candidates understand this reality. Corruption, in an interesting way, funds and supports the electoral process. And I want you to reflect on it. Corruption, in an interesting way, funds and supports the electoral process. It supports democracy, while subverting the rule of law and the basic social justice that the government of we the people expect. In one way, it supports democracy. It also subverts democracy. And I think we need to understand both. These are systemic problems. The systems which created the structure of entitlements, arbitrage opportunities, and supply-demand imbalances, and election campaigns that fostered corruption is unlikely to change. There is a significant vested interest in maintaining the status quo. We need to break through the system and innovate. And therefore, what do? We need to start with the root causes if we have to considerably reduce the imperfections of the system. They relate to a few key areas. Reduce the asymmetry of information. Poverty is a result of asymmetry of information. A farmer does not know the price of vegetables in the city, but the middleman knows. This allows the middleman to hold the subsistence farmers hostage. The experiment that ITC Chopal represents is illustrative of the power of information. The farmers can now check the prices and can decide when to sell and at what price. The role of the middleman and that of the mandi has been transformed. The farmer can get the right price, can enforce contracts, and can connect it to the regional and national markets. Isolation, ignorance, and dependence can be removed rather easily. The rapid diffusion of the cell phone in India, in this context, is a welcome development. All Indians can have access to information when they want and where they want it. Similarly, increasing access and transparency can have a significant effect on governance. The Right to Information Act is a great start, but making governance visible and therefore accountable is critical. Democracy requires its citizens to be well-informed and therefore able to exercise their rights diligently. And I recognize this is an ongoing process. Second, reduce the number of points of interpretation of the laws. The more opportunities for interpretation, regardless of whether laws are vague, citizens lack information, or citizens do not believe that they can get access to justice in a reasonable amount of time, the greater the opportunity for arbitrage and corruption. Making core processes that touch a very large number of citizens, such as access to subsidies, implementation of the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, access to land records, tax refunds, standardized and routine is the prerequisite. Third, increase accountability. Forced ranking of the performance of the bureaucrats, politicians, and the judiciary on implementation of key initiatives is critical. Consider, for example, ranking of all High Court judges on the number of cases disposed, productivity, quality of judgments, verdicts not reversed in a higher court, aging of cases pending before a judge, time it takes to provide the judgment after the arguments are complete, and the number of adjournments granted. Measures of delay would be appropriate. I'm sure we can think of simple, clear measures of accountability for all functions of the government. But measurement of performance alone is not enough. There must be clear consequences for poor performance. somebody must get fired for poor performance. And that may be as important as measuring performance. So the key initiatives that I suggest are the following. The first is a perspective on Indianness. Radical innovations must start with a point of view. What has been lost during the last 50 years in India is a view of Indianness. What does it mean to be an Indian? What rights are all Indians entitled to? What do we believe collectively? What will we defend with our blood? What informs our domestic and foreign policy? We had a point of view during our freedom struggle. For example, Gandhiji taught us 3 important lessons in this regard. Indianness meant nonviolent struggle. It was a non-negotiable for him. It meant total engagement of all, the rich, the poor, rural, urban, men and women. The unifying symbol of resistance was the charkha. It was more than a simple device. He wrote in Young India in 1925, "The message of the spinning wheel is much greater than its circumference. Its message is one of simplicity, service to mankind, living as not to hurt others, creating an indissoluble bond between the rich and the poor, capital and labor, the prince and the peasant. The larger message is naturally for all." So it was very clear. And finally, Indianness meant inclusion of all religions in the broad struggle. Ishwar or Allah is all in your name was the refrain. Jawaharlal Nehru built on this foundation. In his oft-quoted speech on August 15, 1947, he laid out the obligations of Indians and the meaning of Indianness. And I quote, "The future beckons to us. Whither we go and what shall we do and endeavor to bring freedom and opportunity to the common man, to the peasants and workers of India, to fight and end poverty and ignorance and disease, to build up a prosperous, democratic, and progressive nation, and to create social, economic, and political institutions which will ensure justice and fullness of life to every man and woman. We have hard work ahead. There is no resting for any of us till we redeem our pledge in full. We make all people of India what destiny intended them to be. We are citizens of a great country on the verge of a bold advance, and we have to live up to that high standard. All of us, whatever religion we may belong, are equally the children of India with equal rights, privileges, and obligations. We cannot encourage communalism or narrow-mindedness, for no nation can be great whose people are narrow in thought or in action. All democracies need to remind themselves periodically of who they are and what they stand for, especially in difficult times like the one that we are going through. For example, Roosevelt, in his address to the 77th Congress in 1941, had this to say about the United States: "Certainly, this is no time for any of us to stop thinking about the social and economic problems which are the root cause of social revolution, which is today a supreme factor in the world. For there is nothing mysterious about the foundations of a healthy and strong democracy. The basic things expected by our people of their political and economic systems are simple. They are equality of opportunity for youth and for others, jobs for those who can work, security for those who need it, the ending of special privileges for the few, the preservation of civil liberties for all, the enjoyment of the fruits of scientific progress in a wider and constantly rising standard of living. These are simple, the basic things that must never be lost sight of in the turmoil and unbelievable complexity of our modern world. The inner and abiding strength of our economic and political system is dependent upon the degree to which they fulfill these expectations." Just as Roosevelt reminded Americans of the basic promise that America makes to all its citizens and what it means to be an American, it is also time that Indian leaders to restate the unique identity and the obligations of Indians to each other. 60 years later, we have no one to remind us of what Indianness means anymore. Very few would articulate it as well as Nehru did, or practice it so vigorously as Gandhiji did. More importantly, most Indians do not have a sense of the extraordinary scope and scale of social experiment they're an integral part of. By mutual consent and through collective action, India has the potential to be the beacon of hope for the whole world. India can match the grandeur of the accomplishments of the United States in creating a system that Abraham Lincoln so aptly described as the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But sense of Indianness is a prerequisite to accomplish this goal. We have to focus on the very non-negotiables of what it means to be an Indian. This must be the starting point for moving forward. The first building block of social justice for me is the universal ID, which all of you have heard of. And I'll share with you why I think so. Indians traditionally use multiple identification systems ranging from passports to permanent account numbers for income tax, voter identity cards to register and vote in elections, ration cards, below poverty line cards, and so on. Each one of these identification cards are architected differently, and none is universally accepted. The government-citizen interface, as a result, is rendered unnecessarily complex. The multiplicity of cards also renders the provision of services, be it the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act or subsidized rations, difficult to monitor. The intended beneficiaries rarely get the full benefit due to them. Leakages in the system are hard to detect, much less control. The need for a tamper-proof single ID that allows all government-citizen relationships to be managed effectively is obvious. This can provide access to services and transparency in how these services are delivered. Universal ID card would reduce the chances of corruption, as the role of intermediaries, be they local politicians and bureaucrats, who come in between the government's intentions and the citizens, are partially disintermediated. Needless to say that this is a massive job, whether technically, politically, or socially. The task is not just issuing identity cards that are tamper-proof, but in managing the massive database that it entails. The challenge is in architecting a unique system that is low cost, that allows for multiple current applications, and is flexible enough to accommodate new applications as it evolves. Further, India will be the first country to issue a single ID on such a scale in the age of mobile phones and ubiquitous connectivity. The opportunity for innovations in architecting the system, in deploying it, and in effectively disintermediating layers of bureaucracy between the citizen and the government is immense. The government of India must be congratulated in taking this first step, providing a unique identity to every Indian, regardless of religion or economic class. For the first time, we will recognize people as individuals, one person at a time. This can also be the first step in focusing on the rights of an individual and not just the rights of a group. That is why I believe that the universal ID is the basic building block of social justice that the framers of the Constitution had in mind. Second, we can focus on massive education, eradicating the inequality of opportunities. India will remain unequal as long as its citizens do not have equal opportunities for a good education. After 60 years of independence, India still has one of the largest illiterate populations in the world. 35% of India is illiterate, according to the 2001 census. That is more than 300 million people. This represents a population nearly as large as the entire population of India at the time of our independence, and almost the entire population of the United States. It is clear that India has failed in its educational mission. More worrying is that half the children in class 5 cannot do simple two-digit division problems. Nor is there a sign that things are changing fast. The reading and math scores reported so far has not changed measurably over the last 4 years. I did not make up these numbers. Every one of them is referenced, and these are taken from the Government of India publications. The failure is not about adequate resources. Most children now have access to a primary school within walking distance. Most schools have teachers. However, teachers often do not show up. The Ministry of Human Resource Development estimates that only 70% of teachers attend schools in rural India. Even when they show up, they only teach about half the time. Absenteeism is rampant. In Jharkhand, it is 42%, followed by Bihar at 37% and 23% at UP. The difference between states are disturbing. Kerala with 90% literacy and Bihar with less than 45%. Similarly, gender inequalities are staggering. Only 45% of women are literate compared to 75% of men. Poor literacy is also associated with states where population of Dalits and tribals are significant. This is clearly a failure of the public delivery system. There is no question about it. More than 17 ministries at the center are focused on some form of educational initiatives, whether it pertains to specific skills or basic education. Education is a state subject, so the ability to enforce common standards is also very low. This situation calls for radical innovation. This cannot go on. The primary starting point is to focus on a method that can remedy the situation in a very short period of time. I suggested in a paper I wrote 3 years ago, called My Vision for India at 75, that the first step is to educate 500 million Indians in world-class skills. This assumes 100% literacy and a quality of primary and secondary education that can lead to the development of skills or access to college education. The idea of 500 million people to be educated in skills has been accepted, and it was part of the President's address to the Parliament in 2009. This means that the preconditions for innovation in education can now be defined. Inclusion means affordable and accessible. 500 million, unprecedented scale. 10 years, tremendous sense of urgency. World-class, therefore rigorous and global benchmarks. Monetizable skills, therefore relevant to industry. And fungible skills, so that it's a mix of basic theory and practical skills so that people can move on. Inclusion will require that we not only focus on cost, but delivery to remote areas. Access to education in rural India may be as critical as cost of delivery. Scale and urgency are obvious. We have a demographic volcano ready to erupt if young people do not acquire the skills that will enable them to find reasonable jobs. Forcing global standards will allow Indian skills become marketable anywhere in the world. Finally, it must be fungible skills. We should ensure that we provide enough theory, physics, chemistry, math, or language, to enable students to move up skill levels, take college courses and become engineers, or to shift skill clusters from hospitality industry to programming. Needless to say, we need to learn to harmonize these objectives in developing plans for implementation. Such a massive program of education is unprecedented and will need the most creative approach to content development, delivery, and assessment of progress. The ubiquitous connectivity allows us a new approach to improving quality of student engagement in learning. First thing we have to come to terms with is how do we move away from a total dependence on teacher and school-centric delivery mode? Why can't a student in rural Bihar get access to the best teacher in physics or in chemistry in the country? Why can't she or he download a lecture, a problem set, and work with their peers to learn? Why can't learning be modularized? Why can't a student test herself against her cohorts, not just in her village, but also in the district or the nation? All this is possible today. We know the technology, and it is available. Delivering on innovations of this scale requires a coordinated effort. Does India need a central skills development authority that brings together diverse initiatives, as in the Universal ID project? That's a question we have to ask ourselves. Human dignity and self-esteem comes from being educated, being skilled, and well prepared for employment. India cannot deliver on this goal unless we make basic approach to universal education and skill a focused effort which is clear, unambiguous, and non-negotiable. The third is to get focus on citizen-centric governance. As a democracy, Indians can choose their leaders. In this sense, governance of we the people. However, the governance of India is a very institution-centric process. What citizens encounter are an unresponsive and corrupt police, bureaucracy, politicians, and judiciary. The power clearly rests with the institutions. This power asymmetry between citizens and institutions of government is not peculiarly Indian. It is just far more pronounced in India. How we rebalance the power between institution and the citizen is an important question. How do we make institutions responsive? This too requires innovation. The first step is a review of the laws that govern day-to-day lives of citizens. Most of the laws in India have a colonial past. The Indian Telegraph Act of 1855 governs all telecommunications and broadcasting regulations in India. The Indian Penal Code is from 1860. The Indian Contract Act was enacted in 1872. The Official Secrets Act is from 1923. The Banking Regulations Act is from 1949. Needless to say, the acts have been amended and interpreted many times. The sheer architecture of these laws reflects a different context and social system in the country. This makes it difficult to apply the law to new situations, not even imagined when the laws were written. What to preserve of the past and what to discard is a decision that is critical to move towards a more citizen-centric governance. Former Prime Minister Vajpayee, in his second term, promised to rewrite the laws. The first time it was Prime Minister Shastri who wanted to do it. It called it administrative reforms. It was a stalled process then, it is a stalled process now. We need to renew the process. Not all the laws, a subset of laws that need to take a fresh look and must be architected to suit today's needs and rendered simple, easy to understand, and capable of being reduced to few clear rules that require very little interpretation. If not, they should be scrapped. This is the first step towards e-governance. As India gets educated and as well connected, Indians depend more on their cell phones and laptops for work and information. E-governance can become a way for citizens to interact with their government. Initiatives in e-governance in Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka have demonstrated that people are willing to accept the electronic alternative as long as it is easy to use. The use of universal ID, universal education, and ubiquitous connectivity collectively can make e-governance a reality. E-governance combined with the Right to Information Act allows individual citizens to evaluate the performance of politicians who represent them and bureaucrats who manage the institutions of government. Scorecards are easy to overlay on databases that e-governance creates, allowing for the monitoring of delays or violations of rules. Transparency and accountability are easier to safeguard in such a system. And we have to strengthen local management. India is too complex to be governed centrally. That said, we must have non-negotiable national standards regarding laws, the rules of engagement of government with citizens, obligations of Indians to each other, and a collective view of Indianness. We must be focused on the rights of individuals and individual identity, providing equal opportunities and creating a transparent system of government. At the same time, we must be sensitive to and responsive to local context. A task in Kerala in education is different from Bihar. The law and order situation in Ranchi is different from Mysore. We must be nationally integrated and locally responsive simultaneously. Local management has a long history in India. While the northern part of India, it was rendered somewhat ineffective during the Mughal rule, In South, it has flourished. The Chola kings, especially the great Rajaraja Chola, made it clear distinction between central management in his kingdom and local responsiveness. The principles of revenue management and audit were centrally managed. However, local groups had significant authority to manage locally. An excellent example is the management of water and the building of lakes and water allocation and conservation. The king got involved in laying out principles, but was locally administered based on local conditions while maintaining common standards across his empire. Panchayati Raj is not an uncontested topic during the framing of the Constitution. While Gandhiji was for it, Dr. Ambedkar opposed it. Ambedkar saw the village as a source of oppression. Multiple commissions have studied the pros and cons of this problem, notably Mehta Commission in 57, Santanam Commission in 63, Mehta Commission again in 78, Rao in 1985, Singhvi in 86, and finally the 73rd Constitutional Amendment under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao in 1992. More than 3 million people are elected to the local panchayats in India today. This is probably the largest exercise of democracy in the world. However, being a state subject, the freedom enjoyed by the panchayats, resources available to them, and ability to initiate projects that are locally responsive varies a great deal between states. We must recognize that state governments that are unwilling to yield power to local authorities do distort the spirit of local governance. Similarly, local governance without national standards cannot lead to uniformity in the provision of individual rights. Panchayati Raj in reality has not been an unmixed blessing. In some parts of the country, the worry that Dr. Ambedkar expressed has come true. Panchayati Raj can be manipulated to enforce a caste-based management of the village. This distortion often reflects both the regional progress and the variations India is making. Finally, the role of the media. Surprisingly, the media seem to have accepted the pattern of corruption, dysfunctional consequences of coalition politics, religious discord, or judicial delays. No political party is held accountable for the extraordinary expenditures during elections on the show of money power. Public accountability is seldom enforced. Yes, even in this permissive atmosphere, individual excesses may make the news. For example, it is estimated that 50% of the mining operations in Orissa operate without permission. The way bridges are unmanned and do not work. More than 15,000 trucks ply the roads with ore. This scale of corruption seems to have escaped media attention till recently. More importantly, who are accountable for collusion of this magnitude? The only bright spot in this process is the role of the very few brave civil society organizations that work tirelessly to expose the misuse of power. They do make a difference, but they alone, without the support of the population as a whole, and the media in particular, cannot sustain the pressure to change the system. So I believe India is at a very interesting crossroad. It must choose. The path to progress needs significant innovations under discarding of the old and acceptance of the new. Many of the innovations and initiatives are at least partially underway. Many of the challenges that I've spoken about today are well known and well researched. The solutions are also clear. We cannot continue down the same path. If you look at the success stories of India's recent history, in the IT and the outsourcing sectors especially, the lesson is fairly clear. Individuals who are educated and given the right training have made a disproportionate impact on the economic growth and have created opportunities for government where governments alone could not have. They have also given all Indians a sense of pride in their identity and increased the respect with which the country is viewed internationally. This is not just the reality of urban India. The role of the farmers trained and empowered have transformed their lives, the way they interface with the rest of the world, as we see in the work of ITC, Chopal, Amul, Jaipur Rugs, and in many self-help groups around the country. It is all about empowering individuals, providing them capabilities, and allowing to exercise their choices. I expect this trend to grow dramatically with the proliferation of the cell phone and connectivity. I do not want to focus on this success story in a particular industry or in a particular locale. I view this as reinforcement of the idea that when we focus on individual rights and meritocracy, we are better able to achieve collective goals. When we try to focus on groups, we are essentially accountable to no one. After 50 years of focus on group rights, our gains have been too modest and too slow. Gandhiji succeeded because he understood how we combine individual dignity and collective action. Bottom-up revolution in India must start with individuals, their capabilities, their empowerment, their dignity, and their ability to live their lives and realize their dreams. I realize the magnitude of the challenges that this refocus of our effort demands, but we have to start this journey. The universal ID, the focus on literacy and skill development, e-governance and local management with national standards are building blocks of a society that focuses on improving individuals and as a result contributes to the collective progress. We have to accept this reality or resign ourselves to slow progress and very uneven progress. I think the first step is to stop thinking and speaking about the masses. I dare say that we might find ourselves better able to cope with whatever challenges we face when we can articulate a course of action for individuals to take. Whenever we have done that, Indians have risen to the challenge. They've always made the country proud. It wasn't long ago that the rich and poor united and sacrificed for the common good. Imagine if we can motivate more of our citizens to act so bravely and selflessly towards common purpose. Imagine, too, that we can reduce the burden of corruption even by half through a combination of better policy and swift consequences. Many of India's goals begin to seem totally attainable. The crisis in India is a crisis of leadership. There is no one who is willing to articulate a view of India and Indianness with clarity and force so that the country can come together and make the sacrifices needed to build a new India that the framers of the Constitution imagined. Indians are ready to be led again. India is the largest single experiment in democracy and social justice the world has ever seen. Leaders in India, in fact, all Indians, have to ask themselves, what will be the judgment of history? What will be our legacy? I also believe that people want to be heard more than anything else. They hunger for opportunity more than handouts. I draw inspiration from Mother Teresa's words. When I look at the masses, I feel I cannot do anything. When I look at individuals, I know I have to do something. India has more people waiting to be led than any other place on earth. It is time for us to act and act decisively. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As the 7th Nani Palkhivla Memorial Lecture draws to a close, it is my pleasure to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of our trust. Today, we honor the memory of a remarkable Indian, Nani Palkhivla, an orator, ambassador, legal expert, patriot, and above all, a defender of our Constitution. When he spoke, he held his audience spellbound. Those of us who knew him will never forget his integrity, his intellect, and his passion. The Trust wishes to thank Professor C.K. Prahalad, thank you, for delivering this memorial lecture. We are indeed privileged to have C.K., one of the world's most influential business thinkers, with us today. I have known C.K. personally for many, many years, and when we requested him to deliver this memorial lecture, he readily agreed. As a much sought-after management guru, C.K. has a very busy schedule and has traveled a long distance to come and deliver this lecture. While many Fortune 500 companies seek CK's advice, we are fortunate to have him with us today, especially to inspire and motivate a number of young students. Undisputedly, whenever CK talks, he has the rapt attention of all. We shall be publishing the text of this lecture as a booklet for free and wide distribution. I would also like to thank Mr. M.N. Venkatachalaya, former Justice of India, for chairing the panel of judges for the Nani Palkhivla Civil Liberties Award. On behalf of the Trust, I would like to congratulate the winner of the 5th Nani Palkhivla Civil Liberties Award, Mrs. Maya Daruwala. She truly deserves this award. Maya's work is exemplary, but I cannot resist the urge to say that she is a chip of the old block. Many here may not be aware that Maya is the daughter of late Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw. We are grateful to ACC Limited for its generous gesture in sponsoring this evening's function. For the benefit of the younger generation here, as Mr. Maligam said, Nani was the chairman of ACC for many long years. The memorial lecture could not have been a success without the eager support of 9 organizations, which includes management schools who helped the Trust arrange this function. I would also like to thank the numerous students of the different institutes who acted as volunteers and helped us arrange this function. Mr. Khushru Santuk, the chairman of NCPA, like in previous years, has been very supportive of the Trust. We thank him and the staff of NCPA for making this venue available. Last but not the least, I'd like to thank Mrs. Prahalad for being with us here today. May I request all of you to stand for the national anthem.